Reims, September 1944. Here, where in 8 months' time the German Wehrmacht will sign the capitulation papers of unconditional surrender, Hollywood filmmaker George Stevens and his team of press photographers and cameramen are documenting the last days of the Second World War in Europe.
Back in Hollywood, Stevens had directed box office hits featuring stars like Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. Now, his work centered on the fall of the Third Reich. On this visit to a champagne factory, Stevens, a scriptwriter by trade, wanted to know what all the bottles had been intended for. A wedding or a romance? Would they have induced a mere mortal to change his whole life?
In late October 1944, George Stevens and his team were able to set foot on German soil for the first time. After weeks of fighting, American troops had taken Aachen. It was the first German city to fall into Allied hands. Although Stevens and his men were actually going to document the war in black and white, they also had 16mm colour film with them. It produced unique footage.
This young German had tried to stop the GIs with a bazooka. It had cost him his life. Stevens felt little sympathy for the man who plunged Europe and the rest of the world into war.
Remains of the battle for Aachen. The war was already in its 6th year, and no one had any idea when the slaughter would finally end.
Around 13,000 Wehrmacht troops and 5,000 members of the Volkssturm, a national militia rather like a home guard, had defended Aachen against a superior Allied force of 100,000 GIs. On October the 12th, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had insisted that the ancient imperial German city of Aachen be held to the last man. If necessary, the defenders had to be buried among its ruins, just as he had promised his supreme commander, Adolf Hitler.
In the end, however, on October the 21st, 1944, the military commander of Aachen capitulated. He thus saved the lives of some 12,000 men who were now American prisoners of war. Just before capitulating, he sent a heroic radio message.
After bitter house-to-house and man-to-man fighting, the defenders of Aachen have run out of ammunition, food and water. The last remnants of our forces, defending this imperial German city, are engaged in hand-to-hand fighting around the command post. All radios have been prepared for destruction. In the unshakable belief in the justness of our cause and in our victory, this is a final greeting to our beloved German homeland. Long live the Führer.
Out of an original population of 160,000, around 6,000 of Aachen's inhabitants stuck it out while the town was still being contested. For them too, the war was now over, but only a few were willing to see reason.
Only a few weeks after Aachen fell, the US Secret Service stated that many of its citizens were maudlin, had eyes for nothing but their own suffering, and were unwilling to reflect on their own role during the Third Reich. And no one admitted to having been a Nazi. No one questioned whether they might bear any personal responsibility for all that had happened. Writing in her diary on October the 3rd, 1944, in a southern suburb of Aachen, Clara Trafford made a far-sighted comment.
I have had enough forever and a day, but in 20 years' time there will again be enough idiots around who will ignore what has happened and be willing to start the same misery all over again.
In Aachen, George Stevens' team shot roll after roll of film. But because it didn't contain any actual fighting, The footage was never shown on any newsreel. The Hollywood director Stevens took great care not to expose his team to danger. As a result, it was only years later that the color films were found in his estate.
When interrogated, the military commander of Aachen cynically defended the senseless bloodletting in the town. A record of the interrogation states,
"He didn't even think the entrenched resistance was worthwhile. In his view, it would have been far better if the troops deployed in Aachen had been withdrawn in good time and used to strengthen defensive positions east of the town."
It took more than 4 months for the Allies to reach the Rhine. In mid-March 1945, a US Air Force team filmed on the bridge at Remagen. The German Air Force made repeated attempts to destroy the structure, but the Americans doggedly defended their biggest coup so far. Artillery units took up position to secure the only intact bridge over the Rhine. The bridge at Remagen was one of the first locations in Nazi Germany where the Special Film Project 186 was used. On March 7, 1945, US forces managed at the last minute to prevent the railway bridge from being blown up. Within 24 hours, 8,000 GIs had established a bridgehead on the far side of the Rhine, Germany's river of destiny.
All attempts by the German Air Force to block the crossing point were in vain. Even bombarding the bridge with Hitler's wonder weapon, the V-2, proved fruitless. Time and again, German planes were brought down by American artillery fire. Scenes like this were particularly important for the US Air Force camera team. Their mission was to document the aerial battle for Germany so it could be shown in cinemas back home. To make this possible, those responsible had sourced the country for 16mm color film and shipped it to Europe.
One major element of the Air Force cameramen's mission was to document the success of American bombing raids. So in March 1945, a team visited Düren to take on-the-spot footage for the first time. The small town west of Cologne was nothing but a pile of rubble. One reporter with the US military journal Stars and Stripes wrote,
"This place is just a remnant of a town. No one lives here anymore. There are indications that Düren was a town with nice houses." Captain Larkin said, "If the Germans want to have a town called Düren again after the war, they will probably find a nice place a few miles north and build something new there."
At around the same time, on the other side of the border, somewhere in Belgium, American Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had arrived to visit troops. This rare footage was taken by Major Kirk B. Lawton, Eisenhower's man for photojournalism during the Second World War. The Americans staged a military parade as a demonstration of their great self-assurance. Eisenhower was confident that the Allied advance in the West would soon be crowned with success.
He knew that the German Wehrmacht was almost incapable of movement and of low battle strength. But even he wanted to proceed cautiously step by step. The next major objective was a large-scale advance by the Allied armies across the Rhine and deep into the heart of the Reich. Hundreds of thousands of GIs were firmly resolved to finally bring Germany to its knees. But there was tension between the Allies as to the right strategy. Above all, the British were frustrated because they felt the Americans were not paying sufficient attention to their proposals.
Also present at the parade was Hollywood film star Marlene Dietrich. She had hated Hitler and the Nazis ever since emigrating from Germany. Now, behind the front, she was keeping up the soldiers' spirits by singing and giving autographs.
On March the 23rd, 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine on a broad front. More than 1.2 million soldiers were ready to finish off Nazi Germany. Heavy equipment was transported to the other side of the river on hastily erected pontoon bridges.
The Wehrmacht had little to offer in the way of resistance. Adolf Hitler was fully aware of the size of the threat in the West. Germany's commander-in-chief feared that, in view of American superiority, his troops might surrender in droves. One German officer wrote in his diary,
"We sense that a decisive battle is about to begin. The enemy crossed the river at 3 points which initially were separate. On the 22nd of this month, a directive from the Führer was read out to the whole assembled battery. Anyone taken prisoner by the enemy, it said, without being wounded or clearly having given his all, will be punished. Not only will he be disgraced, all financial support for his family will be stopped, and his family will be made responsible for his action." Everyone had to sign to say that they had heard the order.
Cameramen with Special Film Project 186 captured the American advance on the far side of the Rhine.
At this time, a young woman in Frankfurt felt like she was living in a vacuum.
"We're sitting here waiting for the Americans. At last I have the time once again to think about the history of our world, which is so often written by power-hungry idiots. If it didn't cost human lives and thus be so tragic, it would actually be amusing."
On March the 25th, 1945, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels stated that the military situation in the West had entered a critical, almost deadly stage. At the same time, a young girl in the Westerwald region wrote in her diary,
"It's a Sunday like any other, yet, in view of the strange circumstances we can expect, one full of dread and inner turmoil, if only it were all over. It can't be long before the enemy gets here." Suddenly someone shouted, "The Americans are coming!" You've no time to think. Like Schiller, all you can say is, "Everyone runs, rescues, flees." At the back of the village, a sad picture presents itself. Is that our proud German Wehrmacht?
The village has been handed over. Around 200 German soldiers who had gathered here have been taken prisoner. Also on March 25th, Britain's Royal Air Force bombed German positions and roads to block any retreat into the Ruhr district. Only 24 hours after the start of the operation, the British had already established a bridgehead about 10 kilometers wide on the other side of the Rhine. In the hinterland, trucks were waiting to transport sections for more pontoon bridges.
Kirk B. Lawton, Eisenhower's man for reporting the war against Nazi Germany in pictures, was allowed to take his camera into areas occupied by the British and filmed these scenes of a pontoon bridge being built. Lawton had himself ferried across to the other bank of the Rhine by the Royal Signals, a unit deployed behind the front to set up infrastructures and establish telephone links. On the shore, the ground was being swept for landmines planted by the Germans. Here too, many German soldiers had surrendered in the face of superior odds.
British military strategists had prepared Operation Plunder with the utmost precision. Now, top brass in London was expecting the Americans to accept that the further advance into the heart of the Reich would take place under British command. In a conversation with General Eisenhower, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is said to have repeatedly exclaimed, "The Germans are beaten. Now we've got them. They are finished."
But the Americans still kept their British allies in the dark about their own totally different plans. Eisenhower was determined to push his armies mainly into central and southern Germany. He wanted the British to advance towards Hamburg and Denmark. When Winston Churchill heard that, he was outraged. After his fleeting visit to the British troops, Major Lawton returned to Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims.
In early March 1945, Cologne became the first major German city to fall to the Allies. On March the 26th, 1945, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 was allowed to enter the cathedral city for the first time. On this occasion, the US Air Force was interested primarily in the damage caused by the numerous Allied bombing raids on Cologne. Initially, the camera rarely focused on the few people still living in the city. American author and journalist Janet Flanner arrived in Cologne only a few days after its fall. She wrote,
Cologne on the Rhine is now a paradigm of destruction. Cologne has been blown up with its medieval splendor. In the rubble and loneliness of physical destruction, Cologne leans on its banks, bare of any form and unadorned. Those who are still alive laboriously fight their way through the buried side roads, a shriveled population in black clothes and loaded with bundles, silent, like the city.
No one knew exactly how many people were living in the ruins of Cologne. At least 50,000 according to some estimates. But the actual figure could have been as high as 200,000. On March the 26th, 1945, a crowd had gathered on the Klotwigplatz to hear the occupying Americans make proclamations from the back of a truck. In the first few days of the American occupation, one German woman noted,
"We're only allowed to go out during the daytime. After 7 p.m., a curfew comes into effect. We're bombarded with rules and regulations. This time they really are driving militarism and National Socialism out of us. They're not permitting a single trace of what life for us used to be like."
High-ranking Nazis and SS henchmen had fled the city before it capitulated. Above all, the people of Cologne were happy that, for them, the war was over now. One of them said that first and foremost, occupation meant an end to the horrors of air raids and artillery bombardment, to the fear of being evacuated somewhere, whether they liked it or not, and an end to constantly living underground.
A returning émigré, socialist Werner Hansen, was working for the American Secret Service. On March the 27th, 1945, he wrote this about the people of Cologne.
They are very helpful and happy if they can be useful to any American soldier. I walked around the city in uniform for about 8 days. I didn't speak to a single hostile person. I will never forget the old worker's wife who hugged me, crying with happiness and joy, because the Nazis were now gone and we were there.
The landmark of Cologne and the symbol of past German culture survived the war almost undamaged. Allied bomber pilots had been instructed not to endanger the cathedral. When war broke out, the incredible art treasures kept in the Gothic cathedral were taken to a safer location. From one of the cathedral's twin spires, an Air Force cameraman filmed the full extent of the destruction. The many other churches in this Catholic city did not remain as undamaged as the cathedral.
According to official British sources, between 1941 and 1945, 150,000 tons of bombs and 5.1 million incendiaries were dropped on Cologne. The true figure is probably far less, but even so, the city suffered greatly from the continuous aerial bombardment. In March 1945, no one could predict when Cologne would be rebuilt.
Here, on an airfield somewhere in Belgium or in a part of Germany that has already been occupied, a squadron of American P-47 fighter aircraft are preparing to head off on another mission. A cameraman with Special Film Project 186 took this footage of the ground crews in April 1945. For him, these men were the less well-known heroes of the war in the air. They made sure that the aircraft being flown were in the best possible condition.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was a single-engine American fighter bomber which proved to be one of the most effective aircraft in the war against the Nazis. During the Second World War, US manufacturer Republic produced over 15,000 of these all-metal mid-wing monoplanes. The P-47 had just one pilot. As a rule, Thunderbolts attacked their targets in small squadrons. That was also the case in March and April 1945.
Some of the Thunderbolts had automatic cameras on board, which took spectacular pictures. In order to cripple the Wehrmacht's supply routes, the pilots attacked literally anything that moved. Railway lines and freight yards were favourite targets.
Time and again, individual vehicles were also attacked, because every army truck or military staff car that was hit would no longer be able to lengthen the war in Europe. The US Air Force had long since gained control of large areas of German airspace. So as a rule, its planes usually carried out their missions without being threatened. It's not known how many civilians lost their lives in these attacks. The US Air Force regarded such casualties as collateral damage. Troops and fanatical Nazis could have been holed up in harmless-looking villages in order to stop the Allied advance.
The US Air Force's bomber fleet was also in action over Germany, hitting strategic targets. The aim was to make airfields and supply routes unusable. By now, the Luftwaffe was almost incapable of putting up any effective defence. The Nazis had ultra-modern jet aircraft at their disposal, but often their Messerschmitt Me-262s were grounded, mainly because of a shortage of fuel.
Time and again, as they advanced, the Americans came across camouflaged Me-262s. The jet was capable of attacking Allied aircraft at a speed of up to 870 kilometers an hour. Experts eagerly inspected the new aircraft and their futuristic jet engines, which had been developed by Messerschmitt in Augsburg. The US Air Force had every reason to fear the Me-262. Its fleets of bombers had been successfully attacked time and again. American pilots had little chance of defending themselves against the fast jets. Me-262s were still shooting down numerous US aircraft even in March and April 1945.
Somewhere in the occupied part of Nazi Germany, a camera team from Special Film Project 186 is filming a totally devastated airfield. The hangars are all damaged and the wreckage of burnt-out aircraft is strewn around. To enhance the effectiveness of this pan shot, the camera team have placed a portrait of Hitler in it, upside down, of course. It is intended to symbolize the imminent downfall of the dictator and his Nazi regime.
In late March, south of Koblenz, another US Air Force camera team filmed an Allied air attack on a German military convoy. The cameraman repeatedly panned across the destroyed vehicles. We can only imagine the dramatic scenes which took place here. It is not clear whether this convoy, which belonged to the notorious SS, was on its way to the front or was looking for refuge from the advancing Americans. Nor can we tell how many soldiers lost their lives here.
The convoy apparently came under fire on a country road opposite the Marksburg Castle on the Rhine. Spotting it was important to the Americans because units of the Waffen-SS were regarded as particularly dangerous. As a rule, its fanatical troops were ruthless in combat and fought to the bitter end. This devastating attack seriously hit SS supplies and would undoubtedly save many a GI's life in the weeks ahead.
According to notes made by the cameraman, this German was also a member of the SS. He had surrendered to the Americans wearing harmless-looking civilian clothes. It's not clear what happened to him. He was probably taken to a prisoner of war camp. Not far from this scene, peace was already a reality. In a village near Boppard on the Rhine, people can be seen queuing for food. American journalist Martha Gellhorn documented her impressions of the defeated enemy.
No one is a Nazi. Nobody has ever been one. We have had enough of this government, they say. The Americans are welcome to us. We have no reason to be afraid. We have done nothing wrong. We are no Nazis.
"60 kilometers downstream, an automatic camera belonging to the Air Force team took this aerial footage of the bridge at Remagen. The bridge, which had long since become a symbol of imminent victory, had by now collapsed. George Stevens and his team arrived here at the end of March 1945. The Hollywood director had been flown in from Paris at the personal request of General Eisenhower to document the successful advance of the Allied forces.
From his hotel balcony, Stevens could see the pontoon bridge which had been hastily built by US engineers for getting troops across the Rhine. When the United States entered the war, the 40-year-old veteran of Tinseltown had put his career on hold to do propaganda work for the American government. From Remagen, Stevens and his team travelled over the pontoon bridge to the other side of the river. A few young Germans momentarily blocked the cameraman's view of ruined buildings on the riverbank.
Adolf Hitler had declared the Rhine to be an unsurmountable bulwark against the Allied advance in the West. Germany's river of destiny had to be held at all cost. But now in Remagen, the war was already a long way off.
Here, Stevens and his men are inspecting the ruins of the bridge. On March the 17th, 1945, US engineers were carrying out maintenance work on the seriously damaged bridge when it suddenly collapsed. 25 GIs were killed immediately and 3 more died later from their injuries. A plaque commemorates the glorious capture of the railway bridge on March the 7th.
As they retreated, the Germans had mined this tunnel. During the war, it had served the local population as a shelter from Allied bombing raids. A plaque bears the names of those American engineers who lost their lives when the bridge collapsed.
A flight over ruins. In March 1944, Frankfurt's historic Old Town was destroyed in 3 bombing raids by the British. Even then, experts were already thinking about how the city might be rebuilt after the war, but its Nazi bigwigs immediately forestalled such plans.
In 1944, the Nazi Party newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, published an article which rejected any nostalgic sentiment with regard to the later reconstruction of what the paper described as our cities murdered from the air in barbarian attacks. People must be prepared, it said, to take a radical decision and allow that which is dead to rest in its grave. In this respect, hatred must become holy.
In late March 1941, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 documented the damage which American bombing raids had caused to traffic routes and railway tracks in Frankfurt. The cameraman also filmed German prisoners of war being led out of the city. Frankfurt's military commander, Lieutenant Colonel Loeffler, was determined to hold out against the Americans. He told his men,
"If we knew there was nothing to back us up, we could wave a white flag and end matters. But perhaps our leadership still holds a trump card after all. In that case, it must never be said that our, or my, failure prevented it from being played. Therefore, we will do what we have to do."
On March the 27th, 1945, American artillery shells hit the German command post in the city. Loeffler was seriously wounded and died from his injuries. In Frankfurt, too, the war was over.
At the same time, American units were advancing further into the heart of the Reich. Many villages in the Westerwald region offered no resistance. Often, courageous citizens had hung white flags from their windows. This was still dangerous because such actions were punishable by death. Time and again, Germans who were tired of the war and wanted to put an end to the madness were hanged or shot out of hand by fanatical Nazis.
A situation report by the Allied Supreme Command stated,
"The enemy is facing a situation in the West that is beyond his control. There is no point in prolonging operations. Hitler is defeated. However, like all other Napoleons, he is not leaving without fighting to the last breath. It only remains to be seen how long that breath will last, or whether the Germans will be willing to go along with it."
When a town or village surrendered without a fight, everything went smoothly. Often tank traps were removed by the inhabitants themselves so that US armor could advance more quickly. Time and again, however, the GIs faced German soldiers who were still prepared to fight. Afterwards, the wounded were cared for by American paramedics.
On March the 31st, 1945, American troops occupied Bad Hersfeld. After offering brief resistance outside the town, its commander decided to surrender. French prisoners of war welcomed their liberators. A camera team with Special Film Project 186 captured the moment the war for this town came to an end. Here, a delegation from the municipal administration and the military negotiate the peaceful handover with an American advance party. Most of the inhabitants were relieved to have got off so lightly. Some of the buildings were in flames because of artillery fire, but that was the only damage here.
At first, many Germans were still afraid of the victors, but because most GIs were friendly, their fear soon gave way to curiosity. Bad Hersfeld could count itself lucky once again. On March the 31st, 1945, a German soldier waiting in Thuringia for orders wrote in his journal,
"It's uncertain if and how we are going to carry on. It's impossible to get any clear news on just where the front line is. Several wedges have been driven into our area. The aim is obviously to separate North from South Germany. The question is, where will our leaders then go?"
Near Wolfhagen in northern Hesse, a US Air Force cameraman filmed a temporary prisoner of war camp. Hundreds of German soldiers and national militia fighters were crowded together behind barbed wire fences. In a letter to his parents written on April 1st, 1945, a German soldier described the thoughts of the Wehrmacht's last reserves.
"This year we Germans are experiencing one of the saddest Easter festivals in our history. The enemy has penetrated deep into the east and west of our country. But the war will only be lost if we abandon ourselves. Even if Germany capitulated, would the war be over for us? No, that would only be the start of the horror, and we wouldn't even have weapons to defend ourselves. But as long as we still have weapons and firm belief in the rectitude of our cause, nothing is lost. I am convinced that there will be a decisive turn of events. The destiny which the Führer has given us will not permit all the terrible sacrifices to have been in vain."
On this Easter Sunday, American units advanced further north towards Kassel, taking one town after another, as if it were routine. Organized defense, it seemed, no longer existed. But the Americans were worried that there might be fanatical partisan units behind the front. Every civilian could turn out to be a werewolf, as the GIs called them.
Broadcasting from its own radio station on April 1st, 1945, the self-styled Movement of National Socialist Freedom Fighters announced that it would attack enemy troops and German collaborators everywhere in the occupied areas. The werewolves' rallying call was, "Hatred is our prayer, and vengeance our war cry."
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The werewolf consciously turns to the political minority of those stalwart souls who always form the steel tip of the leaden wedge of the people."
In its demise, the Third Reich came up with newer and newer forms of terror, and the regime's henchmen didn't even shrink from murdering its own people if they surrendered to the enemy. Days and weeks of uncertainty still lay ahead of the US troops. Their mission was to bring down Germany with military might, and US camera teams continued to document the end of the war in color. Early April 1945, an airfield somewhere in the occupied part of Nazi Germany. Behind the front, George Stevens and his camera team are taking pictures of German aircraft which have fallen largely intact into American hands. For the last 10 months, Hollywood director Stevens has been filming on behalf of the US military leadership in Europe. The special feature of his work is that he is using 16mm color film.
The aircraft here also include a Messerschmitt Bf-109, a successful model Allied and Soviet pilots learned to fear. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been unable to prevent the Allies from crossing the Rhine. Consequently, the outcome of the war in the West had long been decided. George Stevens and his men were witnessing the demise of the Nazi regime.
The scenes which George Stevens and his team filmed in Bad Wildungen in Hesse were peaceful. This historic spa town had been spared the ravages of war. It was now the headquarters of US General Omar Bradley and his staff, who were planning a further advance to the River Elbe. The American military government had imposed strict rules on the civilian population.
A 7-to-7 curfew was now in place, and freedom of movement was limited to a radius of 6 kilometers from the town. All members of the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS and the Volkssturm, the national militia, had to report to the US commander's office. No one was allowed to use private or public transport. All communication via radio or the postal service was banned. It was also forbidden to read uncensored newspapers.
April the 9th, 1945. As American units advanced further east, they were accompanied by camera teams from the US Air Force's Special Film Project 186. Engineers had built a pontoon bridge over the Werra to ensure troops at the front were kept well supplied. According to US Secret Service reports, Hitler had decided to conduct operations in the south of the country, from his Alpine fortress, as it was known. Consequently, against the wishes of the British, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the West had decided to leave Berlin to the Russians. General Eisenhower had already sent a telegram to Joseph Stalin, informing the Soviet leader that the Americans had no interest in the German capital.
Any obstacle was simply dynamited, and anyone getting in the way of the Americans paid the price. April the 9th, 1945. American units reached the Eichsfeld region in Thuringia. Shortly before, fighter bombers had attacked Günterrode, killing 6 of its inhabitants. Now, peace reigned in the small town.
Not every town or village surrendered without a fight. Orders from Berlin to hold out were still having an effect. In Thuringia, too, time and again fierce fighting cost the lives of many American soldiers. But the cameramen were not allowed to film any dead GIs. Here, a young German soldier has surrendered to the Americans. He has obviously ignored the call from Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery.
Anyone who, without the express permission of the Führer, leaves his district when it is under enemy attack and who fails to fight to the bitter end is scum and will be treated as a deserter. Lift up your hearts and overcome all weakness. The cry now can only be victory or death.
A German non-commissioned officer who was still fighting at the front dryly commented in his diary,
"The emphasis clearly seems to lie on the latter."
On April the 9th, 1945, another cameraman with Special Film Project 186 filmed US troops reconnoitering the situation. According to an intelligence report issued the previous day by the Allied Supreme Command,
it is patently clear that the enemy does not have enough forces in the west even to slow down our advance.
Here, in the middle of Thuringia, the Americans had opened fire on the village of Eberleben. On April the 11th, 1945, a German soldier on the other side of the front line wrote in his diary,
"There is no leadership, no longer any solidarity. The tanks push back everything in front of them. Since they cannot be combated with trucks, tanks or heavy weapons, the will to resist is non-existent. Our troops are wandering around like rabbits. There is no point in carrying our gear and our weapons around. They say the enemy has already taken Apolda and reached Jena. We don't know where to go or what to do. The situation is hopeless. We can only abandon ourselves to our fate."
Any resistance the Germans did put up was quickly crushed by American artillery or aircraft. The GIs then marched on through ruined towns or villages towards the Elbe. Sometimes it was only old men or members of the Hitler Youth who still tried to stop the enemy's advance.
Hollywood director George Stevens and his men were still waiting in Bad Wildungen. The camera team passed the time with trips into the surrounding area. At Frankenburg on the Elbe, Stevens was allowed to film a provisional camp for German prisoners of war.
The Americans were virtually overwhelmed by the task of suddenly having to feed hundreds of thousands of surrendering German troops. They could muster up only the most basic of rations for their prisoners. And with no suitable shelter available, the Germans had to camp out in the open. In Moscow, the almost unhindered advance by American troops was viewed with mistrust. Stalin suspected that the Germans were surrendering in masses in order to spare their best troops for the defense of Berlin.
Soviet author Ilya Ehrenburg commented that the Germans are capitulating with fanatical tenacity. The Americans, he added, were defeating them with cameras, thus implying that in this war they were merely tourists.
Some GIs were heavy-handed in their treatment of enemy soldiers. One German officer wrote in his diary,
"There are growing signs of disintegration and desperation, but we cannot capitulate right at the end and spend the rest of our lives regretting that we have not held out. In the Reich Chancellery it said they are more convinced of victory than we are."
At the end of March, near Oberursel in the Taunus Hills, the Americans turned a German camp for captured Allied airmen into a transit and interrogation center for their own prisoners. Anyone who was unsuitable for providing valuable information was soon dispatched elsewhere. Behind most German soldiers lay years of war in which they had faced death on a daily basis. They had seen their comrades die and had themselves killed enemy troops and civilians. The system they had fought for, and which many of them believed in, was collapsing. No one had prepared them for military defeat. Their commanders had only ever talked about final victory. German prisoners of war were transported back to Wiesbaden on the other side of the Rhine in seemingly endless convoys.
The Golden Mile at Remagen. The Americans had fenced in vast areas with barbed wire. As far as food and hygiene were concerned, conditions in the Rhine Meadows camps, as they were known, were catastrophic. With no billets available, the prisoners lived in the open in holes dug in the ground. According to American reports, in the end, around 170,000 prisoners were crowded together in the Remagen camp.
On April 15, 1945, one German officer in a prisoner of war camp wrote in his diary,
"Spent the night out in the open yet again. It was fairly cold. The only water is for drinking, and there is a big fight for that. Shitting is a problem. It's not organized. The men just shit where they want. Rectangular pits were dug, but the edges soon became bespattered. So people started to shit further and further away, and in the end, all along the barbed wire."
The soldiers were in a weakened state anyway, and disease took a heavy toll. Around 1,200 prisoners in the Golden Mile alone died from dysentery, malnutrition, or exhaustion.
Wiesbaden, mid-April 1945. Since the 21st of March, the Americans had been the town's new masters. The military commander of Wiesbaden, a Colonel Sierenberg, had personally called an end to all combat operations and thus saved the town from further destruction. One cameraman with Special Film Project 186 was particularly interested in how the town's children and adolescents were faring. Many of these youngsters had spent years growing up without a father. Now, if their fathers had survived at all, they could expect to be detained as prisoners of war.
In Wiesbaden, too, people were happy that the nighttime bombing raids on the town were now over. They focused on organizing the basic things they needed for survival. For the children, the ruins were adventure playgrounds. The end of the war had made old taboos no longer valid. Only a short while ago, as members of the Hitler Youth, they were expected to defend the fatherland and the Nazi regime with bazookas. Now they were allowed to be children again. Some were still clearly afraid of their new masters, but most German children were curious about a peace they had never consciously experienced. The victors brought not only chewing gum and cigarettes with them, but also the hope of a normal life.
A flight over the Rhine near Bingen. The historic Maus Tower was only caught in the picture by chance. The US Air Force wanted to get an idea of the destruction to Germany's infrastructure. Freight depots and marshalling yards had been the favorite targets of American bombers. The Germans had blown all road and rail bridges over the Rhine at Wiesbaden and Mainz, so huge pontoon constructions had to be built to replace them.
In towns and villages on the Rhine, the post-war period had already begun. Further east, however, the Americans were still fighting their way to the Elbe. One area where they met with resistance was around Freiburg an der Unstrut. SS units, which were often comprised of guards from sub-concentration camps that had been abandoned, put up far more fanatical resistance than the hopelessly overextended soldiers of the Wehrmacht.
The US Army had not changed its tactics. Anything thought to be a defensive line, like Neuenburg Palace, which dates back to the Middle Ages, came under massive bombardment from tanks and artillery. The advancing GIs were given support by the US Air Force. As a rule, resistance was then quickly broken.
It seems like a refugee trek has reached this village. But surrender was still dangerous. Time and again, deserters or soldiers and officers who were ready to capitulate were shot, as Hitler had ordered.
Anyone who is not prepared to fight for his nation but betrays it at this most critical time does not deserve to live and must be executed.
Nordhausen in the south of the Harz region. In mid-April 1945, Hollywood director George Stevens and his team were allowed to visit Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, which had been liberated by special units a few days earlier. The Americans had long known that one of the Third Reich's most important armories was located here. George Stevens had been given special permission to film because details of arms production here were regarded as valuable information for the future. V-1 and V-2 rockets were built in an underground factory. Engines for the A-4 rocket, which the Nazis had described as their miracle weapon, would soon be sent to the United States for further use. The deadly missiles were built in Kornstein by concentration camp inmates and forced labourers. The slave workers used by the SS had their own hut camp. In a letter to Washington, Stevens wrote,
"So completely without record of their past lives had these creatures been left, that of 2,000 odd men and women and children, it was possible to identify but 4 men by name and nationality."
The few prisoners who survived were closer to death than life. Shortly before the arrival of the Americans, most of them had been sent on death marches. This is how a GI later described the Americans' arrival in Nordhausen.
There are no words to describe the stench. Many of the guys were tough. They had been battle-hardened since they landed in Normandy. But now they were quite sick at the sight and had to throw up. Most of my comrades had no personal reason to fight the Germans. They thought that many of the stories they had read in newspapers or heard about were made up, or at least exaggerated. They only realized what it was really about when we came to Nordhausen.
Forced labourers from countries occupied by the Germans were making their way west. This truck was carrying French prisoners of war interned after their country was defeated by Germany in 1940. George Stevens and his team also visited the nearby town of Nordhausen. The place was teeming with liberated slave labourers who, from 1943, had to assemble aircraft parts in an old Air Force barracks. In the meantime, the film director and his men had received new marching orders. They were told to get ready to head for the Elbe to document the Americans' link-up with the Red Army.
On April the 16th, 1945, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 reached Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. Written above the gates are the words, "Right or wrong, my fatherland." Most of the SS guards had fled 5 days previously. The inmates had overpowered the henchmen who had remained and handed the camp over to the advancing US troops.
Buchenwald is less than 10 kilometers from the center of Weimar, the city of poets and thinkers. Set up in 1937, the concentration camp was one of the biggest in the German Reich. In Buchenwald and its subcamps, nearly 280,000 people from more than 50 nations were exploited, tortured, and used for medical experiments.
Conditions in the huge camp complex came as a total shock for the GIs. The 21,000 prisoners had not been given any bread for 3 days. At least 5,000 of the survivors were in a critical state. Every day, more than 200 inmates died from malnutrition and typhoid.
In all, 56,000 people failed to survive the horror of Buchenwald. This is how US journalist Edward R. Murrow described Buchenwald in a radio report.
As I walked down to the end of the barracks, there was applause from the men too weak to get out of bed. It sounded like the hand clapping of babies. They were so weak. For most of it, I have got no words. Dead men are plentiful in war, but the living dead in a camp. The country roundabout was pleasing to the eye, and the Germans were well fed and well dressed.
On April the 16th, 1945, 1,000 citizens of the nearby town of Weimar were forced to visit the camp. The commanding US general had decided that the population had to be confronted with the extent of the atrocities. In a letter to his sister, one inmate described their reactions.
Only the modest remnants of reality were still visible, but even that was enough to make some people faint. Time and again, people exclaimed in desperation, "But we had no idea." Now, after years in which they regarded and treated us as criminals, all of a sudden they are confronted with the certainty of a guilt that can never be expunged.
In an internal report, US General Eric F. Wood doubted the educational effect of the operation.
After the visit, many citizens had the cheek to claim that they had never heard of this camp, although it had been very close by.
April the 20th, 1945. On Hitler's birthday, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 filmed American tanks on their way to Leipzig.
Troops of the 69th US Infantry Division had captured the city the day before. They had met with very little resistance. For days previously, resistance fighters had been distributing leaflets in Leipzig bearing slogans like "Put an end to the Nazis' crazy war" and "Get your white flags out."
In the town hall, the camera team filmed a gruesome scene. An unknown Nazi bigwig lay next to a portrait of Hitler. It seems he had chosen suicide in order to avoid the shame of capitulation. In the mayor's office, along with his wife and his daughter, municipal treasurer Kurt Lissow had also committed suicide.
On this day, April the 20th, a woman in southern Germany wrote in her diary,
Hitler's birthday. Listening voluntarily for the first time to a speech by Goebbels, I asked myself whether it was already madness or simply cunning, whether he was cold-bloodedly playing a double role. Party leaders are committing suicide because well over half of Nazi Germany is occupied. The Eastern Front is getting closer by the day. Everywhere bombs are falling, day and night, even on peaceful villages, near us too, and Goebbels is talking as if victory were imminent.
The centre of Leipzig lay in ruins. An Air Force cameraman meticulously documented the damage.
In Leipzig, too, right to the end, there were fanatics who would rather believe the propaganda than look reality in the face. Leipzig had fallen on the evening of April the 19th. Only those in the monument to the Battle of the Nations had no thought of surrendering. The city's military commander and a good 300 soldiers and members of the national militia and the Hitler Youth were holed up inside the Colossus. Colonel von Ponset still believed in ultimate victory. He repelled several American attacks, which saw defenders being killed and wounded. It was only when a shell flew through the window and exploded inside the monument that von Ponset was prepared to negotiate and finally surrendered.
Just outside Leipzig, liberated British and French prisoners of war posed for the camera. Now it was the turn of German soldiers to prepare for lengthy detention. Anyone who was able to tried to get behind the American lines and surrender there. On no account did men want to fall into the hands of the Red Army. Many of the troops had held out for weeks in positions on the Elbe and Oder. It was only slogans like "Victory" or "Siberia" that had motivated them to hang on in order to save what can be saved. The American advance had then made it easier for most of them to lay down their arms.
April the 25th, 1945. Near the town of Wurzen, cameramen with Special Film Project 186 took particularly impressive footage of German soldiers and members of the national militia who had surrendered voluntarily to the Americans. Along the west bank of the Mulde, the Americans had halted their advance and taken up position. This had been agreed with the Red Army, which was approaching the Elbe from the east. Wehrmacht units trying to make their way west found themselves in no man's land between the fronts. According to a report by the 1st United States Army,
enemy troops opposite the Mulde line feared above all the approach of the Russians, and in the fear of becoming Russian prisoners of war, fell into our lines to surrender.
Within a short space of time, tens of thousands of German soldiers became American prisoners of war in this section of the Mulde line alone.
Wurzen lay in the middle of no man's land. The previous day, the town's mayor, Armin Grebert, had surrendered to the Americans without a fight. On April the 25th, Wurzen was overflowing with refugees heading west. Residents and liberated slave laborers were filmed plundering storage warehouses at the station. One young woman noted,
"In an instant, a disgusting fight for food broke out. The town is an absolute Babylon, a mix of indescribable characters, and the Germans are not the best of them. It seems as if there will never be peace and calm here. What helps most is writing something every day. It's an activity you can withdraw into to counter the unreality of these days with small realities that are familiar."
Since 1940, around 1 million French prisoners of war had been deported to the Third Reich to replace the manpower of German workers called up by the Wehrmacht. French slave labor was particularly indispensable in agriculture to maintain Germany's food supply. As a rule, these forced laborers were themselves given meager rations containing nothing like the calories normally required by a worker. On April the 25th, 1945, near Wurzen, a cameraman with Special Film Project 186 filmed an almost endless stream of French forced laborers who were now allowed to return home.
Numerous horse-drawn carts with German civilians could also be seen heading west. Most of them already had a long journey behind them, from East Prussia, Pomerania or Silesia. They had suffered weeks and months of deprivation, always in search of food and shelter, and always in fear of being attacked or being killed between the fronts. For these people, their final destination and their whole future were still uncertain.
"30 kilometers north of Wurzen, Hollywood director George Stevens and his team made a stop. At Düben, on National Route 2 to Berlin, the 104th US Infantry Division had taken position and was first of all doing some cleaning up. The Timber Wolves, as they were known, had been in Europe since August 1944 and had fought their way through the Hürtgen forest, Holland and the Ardennes. At the beginning of April, they had liberated Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Now they had reached the west bank of the Mulde and were involved in final skirmishes with scattered units of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS.
Here too, on April the 25th, 1945, the war was over. Vast numbers of German soldiers were fleeing across the Mulde. In their section of the front, the Americans turned to unconventional methods in an attempt to cope with the situation. They dropped leaflets over the fleeing troops, calling on them to form groups of 500 men each and to appear on the eastern bank of the river at half-hourly intervals, naturally with their weapons unloaded. In this way, over the next 4 days, more than 16,000 German soldiers reached safety as prisoners of the timber wolves. George Stevens still had no idea that the British and the Americans had decided to halt their advance on Berlin. He desperately wanted to film the demise of the Nazi regime alongside US troops in Hitler's capital. Instead, he had to be satisfied with experiencing the end of German bellicosity in a small town in the middle of Germany. On April the 26th, George Stevens and his team set out for Torgau. Their brief was to document the link-up of American and Russian forces. Berlin was already a long way off for the GIs. Later, one member of Stevens' escort wrote,
"People resigned themselves to the fact that we weren't going to Berlin. The feeling had overwhelmed them that the war wouldn't last much longer. For the first time, there were no more enemies. It's a nice feeling when you're driving around in a jeep. We could rest by the Elbe."
The first Red Army soldier they met welcomed them with a grin and the word capitalists. Then he pointed to himself and said, "Communist." April the 26th, 1945, also saw the first official meeting between the Soviets and the Americans. It had been organized to take place on the Elbe Bridge at Torgau and was filmed by a camera team with Special Film Project 186. Each side had prepared a big celebration. The pictures were supposed to go all round the world.
April the 27th, 1945, Elbe Day. The great celebration began in the midst of refugees crossing the river. But the first unofficial link-up had already taken place 2 days previously. 40 kilometers upstream, an American reconnaissance team had encountered a Soviet patrol purely by chance. It wasn't exactly a suitable location for such a symbolic event. The spectacle, which took place in Torgau on April the 27th, was named East Meets West. Allied representatives from Britain and France had also been invited.
For George Stevens and his team, every scene was important. They succeeded in capturing the casual atmosphere that prevailed. Soviet camera teams and photographers were also present for the momentous occasion. The Russians took a great interest in the equipment the Americans had with them. Harold Denny reported for the New York Times,
"The Western Front and the Eastern Front are finally united, and Germany is cut in two. On the American side, the honor of sealing the Union fell to General Courtney H. Hodges of the First Army, the force that attacked the shores of Normandy last June and advanced 700 miles through France, Belgium and Germany to this point. Representing the Russian side was Marshal Ivan S. Konyev of the 1st Ukrainian Army, which fought its way clear for 1,400 miles against the fiercest resistance history has ever seen.
The spectacle in Torgau was an event for the entire world. The link-up meant more to the Americans than the Soviets. Moscow chose to see itself as the sole victor over Nazi fascism. The joining of the two sides was of particular significance for the Western world because it symbolized the end of the war. Just 2 weeks before, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died suddenly. For the Nazi leadership in Berlin, this offered a glimmer of hope that America's alliance with Stalin might fracture. But Torgau showed exactly the opposite. On this day, America's new president, Harry S. Truman, ceremoniously announced,
"The union of our arms in the heart of Germany has a meaning for the world which the world will not miss. It means, first, that the last faint, desperate hope of Hitler and his gangster government has been extinguished."
In his speech, Truman expressed a wish which, even at this point in time, was unrealistic.
Second, the junction of our forces at this moment signalizes to ourselves and to the world that the collaboration of our nations in the cause of peace and freedom is an effective collaboration which can surmount the greatest difficulties of the most extensive campaign in military history and succeed.
In his article for the New York Times, Harold Denny agreed with the president.
The spirit in which the Americans and Russian troops and their respective commanders met was worthy of the great occasion. The Russians received us with generous hospitality, and our men responded accordingly. From the moment an outpost of the Russians picked up the first American patrol, there was an almost continuous celebration. The Russians arranged banquets with food and vodka, and the Americans brought cognac and champagne, drinks they had liberated from German army depots. And then there was toasting and singing, an expression of hope for a future in which Americans, Russians, and British would stand together for a lasting peace.
The alliance against Hitler was close to its objective, but shortly after victory was achieved, it would crumble. On April the 27th, 1945, 3 days before the German dictator committed suicide, and 11 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, the post-war era in international politics began. The west bank of the Elbe, April 1945. At Schörneck, south of Magdeburg, engineers have built a temporary bridge and named it after America's new president, Harry S. Truman. They've also called it the Gateway to Berlin, but that is not the direction in which the GIs will be marching. The other bank of the river is where the area under Soviet control begins. Stalin's troops were already engaged in bloody street-by-street fighting for Hitler's capital.
So Hollywood director George Stevens and his team of photographers and cameramen had to forget all thoughts of filming in Berlin.
Following the celebrations at Torgau, Stevens had received new instructions. He was to head south, where the 99th Infantry Division was on the verge of liberating Dachau concentration camp. It was to be his worst experience of the war.
Dachau was where I learned about life.
Since D-Day, George Stevens had accompanied American troops halfway across Europe. He had witnessed the liberation of Paris and the defeat of the Wehrmacht. In his equipment, Stevens had 16mm color material, which lent an oppressive authenticity to the scenes he filmed. As an experienced Hollywood director, Stevens knew the magical effect of pictures all too well.
On April the 26th, 1945, American tanks were advancing east of Nuremberg. Over the last few days, the GIs had once again been involved in heavy fighting with fanatical Nazis. It was still not clear whether, despite what he had announced, Hitler really had left Berlin, and now, together with his closest followers, was ensconced in what he called his Alpine fortress. At this time, camera teams with Special Film Project 186 were in action in Nuremberg. They too were using 16mm color film. Their brief was to document the successful story of the US Air Force in the fight against Nazi Germany. Hitler had ordered the city of the Nuremberg rallies to be defended to the last man. But on April the 20th, Nuremberg finally fell.
Its inhabitants looked to the future, to the new era under American occupation. But their traumatic experiences remained unforgotten. To make things as difficult as possible for the Americans, the Germans had blown all the bridges. But within a few days, engineers had built temporary bridges to guarantee supplies to the troops. The fighting was fierce, even in the suburbs of Nuremberg. But in the city centre, order had totally collapsed. On April the 12th, 1945, journalist Franz Nadler wrote in his diary,
"Nuremberg is dead. There is no light and no electricity. There is no gas and virtually no water. There is untold misery, unspeakable hardship. So many people are sick or dying. But there are only few doctors. There are no coffins for the dead, no hearses to collect them."
An automatic camera filmed Nuremberg from the air. Allied bombing raids had caused massive destruction. Around 90% of the city lay in ruins. More than 8,000 people had been killed. The many days of urban warfare had made the situation in the city centre even worse. Historic buildings that had been spared over the last few months had now collapsed.
April the 26th, 1945. In the shadow of the ancient city wall, a boy in short trousers stands out. Like many other youngsters his age, 12-year-old Friedrich Erhard was searching the rubble for anything of use. He and 4 friends then posed for the US Air Force cameraman.
Throughout the city, the victor's rules were announced by microphone. One of the first measures was to impose a curfew from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. During this time, no one was allowed to set foot outside their home without permission. The military police were ordered to shoot anyone who had no permit or tried to hide or escape. The US military journal Stars and Stripes stated quite plainly,
"The Americans did not come to Germany to pat the hats of child murderers and to nurse SS criminals."
In line with a policy of non-fraternization, GIs were forbidden to have any contact with Germans. Nuremberg's infrastructure had collapsed completely. The daily fight for survival centered on the search for food and water. The Red Cross had set up a water point by the city wall. People formed an orderly line as they waited with their buckets.
"10 days before, there had been chaos here with wanton looting. The whole area," Fritz Nadler wrote in his diary, "had become one vast and shoddy store." Those with nothing more than a minor wound could count themselves lucky. Only a few days ago, this Air Force soldier too had been a bitter enemy of the Americans.
The camera team with Special Film Project 186 filmed the sites of the former Imperial City. Because of the danger from bombing raids, when war began, the 14th century beautiful fountain was bricked in.
On April the 20th, 1945, the Americans had given the Gauleiter, the district leader, an ultimatum. But the fanatical Nazi had no intention of capitulating on Hitler's 56th birthday. No surrender was his curt response. As a result, the slaughter in the streets of Nuremberg continued until the evening.
In the end, the district leader was found dead. During the 5 days of urban warfare in Nuremberg, around 400 soldiers and members of the national militia were killed. 371 civilians also lost their lives. This is how an eyewitness described the desperation during the siege of Nuremberg.
In bunkers and cellars, people sat pressed together. Pale, sick, passive figures. Totally exhausted, they just stared at the stretchers where our wounded lay.
Now people were looking to the future, along the lines of "let the past be." But the victors would not be so quick to forget the role that Nuremberg had once played for the Nazis.
On April the 21st, 1945, the US Air Force camera team also filmed at the old Nazi rally site in Nuremberg. Here, where Adolf Hitler had once given his inflammatory speeches, GIs enjoyed the entertainment provided by jazz musicians and other artists. It wouldn't be long before many Germans would also be gripped by this feeling of being alive. Swing instead of military music, the ultimate defeat of the Nazis' murderous ideology.
On April the 27th, 1945, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 accompanied a reconnaissance unit on a trip through Franconia. The soldiers were looking for a suitable site for a new airfield for the US Air Force. Eventually, they reached a former Luftwaffe airfield that had been destroyed. To make the pictures more impressive, the men had set fire to this wreck once again. There was also little left of the hangars. Here too it was thought that fresh flames would make the scene look more dramatic. It is not known whether the reconnaissance unit finally chose this location as the site for a new US airfield. Even villages in Franconia still reveal traces of the final hostilities. Here, a tank barrier has been cleared away. White flags as a sign of capitulation.
Here, a GI is interrogating Germans who have surrendered. With hardly any Wehrmacht troops still fit for action, old men and children were supposed to defend their villages. A motley crew deployed as a last resort. Even the chief of staff of the notorious SS Army Corps, which in the first 3 weeks of April had still put up fierce resistance in Franconia, admitted later that because of American military superiority and our total own exhaustion, we were scarcely in a position to offer serious resistance.
Here, too, German prisoners of war are held in provisional camps with no roof over their heads. The cameraman's notes do not tell us why these men in civilian clothing were also interned. They had probably drawn suspicion to themselves or belonged to the Nazi Party. The Americans were still afraid of partisan activity by units in civilian dress. The werewolves, as they were known, who could mount attacks in the occupied areas. Prisoners in uniform had to be treated in line with the Hague Convention. One of its stipulations was that prisoners of war be allowed to write to their families. But in the weeks and months that lay ahead, it would be impossible for the US military authorities to deliver letters in a totally devastated Germany. So for a long time, wives, parents and siblings had no idea whether their husbands, fathers, sons or brothers had survived the war.
In late April, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 reached the town of Plauen. Plauen had been a National Socialist stronghold even at an early stage. This is where the precursor of the Hitler Youth movement was founded, the organization which systematically steeped Germany's young generation in hatred and fanatical militarism. An entire generation was exposed to the lunatic ideology of the Nazis, at home, at school, and in youth organizations. Years of brainwashing that could not be expunged from one day to the next.
In late February 1945, Plauen was one of the main targets for British and American bombers. When the US Air Force team filmed in Plauen, a good 80% of the town centre lay in ruins. More than 2,300 people had been killed in the bombing raids. The survivors were slowly beginning to rebuild their town. Anything that could still be useful was salvaged from the rubble.
The cameraman took particular care to film the ruins of this building. All that has remained intact is a relief of the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who in the late 19th century had unified. At this point in time, unification seemed lost forever. The cameraman also took the first ever color pictures of the Rebel Women, as they were known. Women engaged by the American occupying forces to do clearance work. All women between the ages of 15 and 50 had to report for duty. They were paid for their efforts in the form of better food rations. In the midst of all this desolation, a picture was taken which symbolized hopes of a brighter future. It shows an American soldier in Plauen giving a small boy some chocolate.
In spring 1945, Germany was virtually defenseless against British and American bombing raids. Even the anti-aircraft batteries, which were usually located outside the towns, had little impact. In late April, a US Air Force cameraman filmed a flak emplacement somewhere in a part of Germany that was already occupied. As early as 1943, boys born between 1926 and 1928 were manning flak batteries. In 1945, all fit men aged 16 and older had to fight at the front. So in the final stages of the war, even 15-year-old children were deployed as Air Force helpers, as they were known.
April the 30th, 1945. Here, American M4 Sherman tanks have taken position somewhere in Bavaria and are shelling a village. These pictures, it seems, were staged for the cameraman, because by this time, US forces were encountering hardly any resistance. In all likelihood, the buildings on fire only served as practice targets.
On April the 30th, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz learnt that in his last will and testament, Adolf Hitler had appointed him President of the Reich and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. What Dönitz did not know was that Hitler and his newly wedded wife, Eva Braun, had already committed suicide in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Dönitz sent Hitler a telegram, a declaration of loyalty which documents the total blindness of the Nazi leadership.
My Führer, my loyalty to you will be unconditional. I shall thus continue to make every attempt to relieve you in Berlin. But should fate still force me to head the Reich as your personally appointed successor, I shall see this war through, just as the unique heroic struggle of the German people demands.
The American tanks could only progress slowly in difficult terrain. Their goal was the so-called Alpine Fortress. General Eisenhower was still afraid that the enemy's political and military leadership had absconded to Upper Bavaria and was entrenched in the mountains.
If the Germans were allowed to establish this fortress, they would possibly force us into a prolonged guerrilla war.
On April the 24th, 1945, 6 days before Hitler's suicide, US General Omar Bradley had given a gloomy situation report. He told a parliamentary delegation from Washington,
"The war against Germany may last another year."
Time and again, the GIs had to clear tank barriers built by villagers. The terrain was not suitable for the use of heavy weapons. Narrow mountain roads and bridges made progress difficult. Here, the numerical superiority of the Americans played hardly any role. While the Red Army was conquering Berlin in bloody urban warfare, American elite troops were making their way along peaceful mountain roads and through idyllic alpine villages in search of German bunkers and fortifications.
A flight over Dachau concentration camp near Munich. Set up in 1933, it was the first concentration camp on German soil. Here, for 12 long years, inmates were tormented, tortured, and murdered. On April the 30th, 1945, George Stevens and his team entered the camp. They found a train full of corpses, victims of the death marches, as they were known. Concentration camp inmates who, on their odysseys through Germany, had starved or frozen to death or been shot. In a report written later, Stevens noted, "It was like wandering through Dante's vision of hell."
US troops had reached the concentration camp north of Munich the previous day and liberated over 30,000 prisoners. On April the 30th, 1945, one of the survivors, Edgar Kupfer-Kobowitz, wrote in his diary,
"American soldiers come into the camp to look at us. A group of them were taken to a block. In the washroom lay the corpses of 50 inmates who had died of starvation or exhaustion. When one of the officers saw the bodies, it brought tears to his eyes. It is strange to think that a man who had been in a battle and seen so many corpses, an officer in the middle of a war, should weep at the sight of our dead. But I know that. I know what our dead look like. The sight is so shocking that even the tears of a warrior are understandable."
Some of the GIs reacted with uncontrollable rage and shot around 50 of the guards, but most of the culprits were arrested. George Stevens' team filmed the SS tormentors, who now claimed that they were nothing more than insignificant underlings who had only been obeying orders. Just how afraid the inmates were is documented by an entry in the diary of Dutch resistance fighter Nico Rost. A day before the camp was liberated, Rost wrote,
6:30 a.m. The SS have raised a white flag. Are the Americans so close? Will the SS, who have remained, hand over the camp without a fight and kill us first? I don't even trust the SS's white flag. Why do they still threaten us with their machine guns? No, the SS will always be the SS until they are destroyed.
Guards who at the last moment had disguised themselves as inmates were identified by real camp inmates. Members of the SS could also be identified by the tattoos on their arms, which indicated their blood group. This man really was an inmate. The number tattooed on his lower arm proves it.
George Stevens and his team spent a few days in Dachau to document conditions in the camp as accurately as possible. One major problem in Dachau was the risk of an epidemic breaking out. Former inmates helped with the delousing. To feed the survivors, the Americans brought bread to Dachau from their army supplies. But even after liberation, many inmates still died as a result of their suffering. American journalist Martha Gellhorn was in Dachau when, on May 8, 1945, a Polish doctor told her that Germany had surrendered unconditionally.
I was in Dachau when the German armies surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. We sat in that room, in that accursed cemetery prison, and no one had anything more to say. Still, Dachau seemed to me the most suitable place in Europe to hear the news of victory. For surely this war was made to abolish Dachau and all the other places like Dachau and everything that Dachau stood for, and to abolish it forever.
A flight over Munich, the capital of the Nazi movement. Here, the Second World War ended on April 30th, 1945, the day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. US troops occupying the Bavarian capital met with little resistance. Munich too had suffered heavily from British and American bombing raids. A team with Special Film Project 186 used an automatic camera to gain an impression of the extent of the damage. One Air Force cameraman in Munich was interested not so much in living conditions in the city as in its political past.
Before the war, Hitler had had grandiose parades staged on the Königsplatz. Whenever he was in Munich, he stayed at the Führerbau, the Führer's building. Party bigwigs had tried to protect it with camouflage netting.
The Prince Karl Palais, until 1933, the official residence of Bavarian presidents, was deserted. Under the code name Pheasant Hunt, patriotic forces had called for resistance against the Nazis. But only a few of Munich's citizens reacted. Even with the Americans at the gates of Munich, Hitler's governor of Bavaria also refused to lend his support to the movement, which was brutally crushed. In the end, Munich was taken without a fight. The House of Art, too, was still covered with camouflage netting.
It was in the Palace of Justice in 1944 that the members of the White Rose were sentenced to death. Led by Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie, the group had distributed flyers calling on people to renounce the Nazi regime. The Brown House, the Nazi headquarters in Munich, had been totally destroyed in a bombing raid. It was at the Feldherrenhalle, the Field Marshal's Hall, in 1923 that Hitler's attempted putsch failed.
On May 2, 1945, the Germans learned that their Führer was dead. He had allegedly fallen in battle. Journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary,
"Hitler is dead, and we all behave as if it did not concern us. Events had surged over him. The Third Reich has vanished, like some spectre. With the swastikas on his Nazi flags, Herr Hitler, too, has landed on the rubbish dump. Go to hell, Führer and Reich Chancellor. Tempi passati, you don't interest us anymore."
In negotiations with the Americans, Munich's Cardinal, Michael Faulhaber, tried to improve living conditions for the city's inhabitants. Looting was still a daily occurrence. But the occupying forces quickly put an end to the chaos. Here too, people were glad that the war was finally over.
All that was left of the Hofbräu house was the facade. It was in this world-famous tavern that Adolf Hitler's career as an inflammatory orator began. GIs on guard at the Bürgerbräukeller. In November 1923, Hitler proclaimed the National Socialist Revolution here. Now the historic beer hall was being used by the US Army as a canteen.
While the cameraman with Special Film Project 186 was filming in Munich, George Stevens also arrived in the city. The Red Cross was using the Maximilianeum as a military hospital. In 1949, Bavaria's democratically elected state parliament would move in here. The Hollywood director and his team recharged their batteries after the strain and stress of the last few weeks. The indescribable pictures of the horror of Dachau were pursuing George Stevens, and he was glad for a change. While people were still dying in the concentration camp north of Munich, in the city itself, its inhabitants were already sunbathing again by the River Isar.
Stevens and his team also visited the holy sites of the Nazi regime, like the Brown House, which now lay in ruins, and the Königsplatz, with the Temple of Honor, which housed the ostentatious sarcophagi of those killed in the attempted putsch of 1923. Stevens did not know that Georg Elser, who had once tried to kill Hitler with a bomb in the Bürgerbräukeller, was murdered shortly before Dachau was liberated.
From Munich, US Air Force camera teams drove south and west along Hitler's autobahns. Near Augsburg, a cameraman discovered strange-looking aircraft on the edge of the autobahn. They had obviously been parked there to avoid enemy bombing raids. Now the wrecks were just scrap metal. But as wonder weapons, these Me-262s had been expected to change the course of the war.
These planes don't actually look like conventional fighter aircraft. They're more like futuristic designs from science fiction films. The Me-262 was the first jet fighter. At the time, it was also the world's fastest aircraft. Here, the jet engines have apparently been dismantled. American special units probably took them somewhere safe for transportation to the United States. Near Augsburg, too, there was a closely guarded production site where slave workers had to build the Me-262.
A camera team with Special Film Project 186 has reached Berchtesgaden. On May 4, 1945, the town surrendered to the Americans without a fight. In a flyer addressed to its citizens, District Chief Executive Theodor Jakob had expressed the hope that our women and children and our beloved homeland will thus be spared grave misfortune. Nevertheless, the first few days of American occupation were marked by assaults and even rapes. But the US military administration finally got such excesses under control.
Berchtesgaden wasn't just any town in the Third Reich. Located close by was the Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat, which was clouded in secrecy. Now the complex was just an expanse of rubble. Because in the early morning of April the 25th, 1945, the restricted zone for the Führer got an unwelcome visit. British bombers devastated the area to prevent it serving the dictator and his entourage as a final retreat. By now it was clear to the Americans that they had been fooled by a propaganda lie, as General Bradley later openly admitted.
The Alpine fortress took on such an exaggerated form that I wonder how we could be so stupid as to believe it.
At the center of the complex was Hitler's Berghof residence with its huge panorama window. Now it was the attraction for all the GIs. Shortly before the Americans arrived, the good citizens of Berchtesgaden looted not only Hitler's retreat, but also the underground bunkers, which were chock full of foodstuffs. In 1939, a road had been blasted out of the mountainside, especially for the Führer, so that the Kehlstein house could be built on the summit. Because snow was still lying here, the camera team couldn't get right to the top. So the cameraman made do with taking these shots of the locals. It wasn't only Hitler who enjoyed a domicile on the Obersalzberg. Other important Nazis also had their own villas here.
Near Berchtesgaden, American troops discovered an abandoned freight train fully laden with art treasures. The valuable sculptures, paintings and tapestries had all belonged to Hermann Göring. Hitler's second in command had greedily snatched up works of art from all over Europe and kept them at his estate near Berlin. With the Red Army advancing, Marshal of the Reich, Göring, had everything crated up and transported south. But he could no longer take delivery of his art collection because on April the 23rd, 1945, Hitler had removed Göring from all his offices and had him placed under arrest. The stolen works of art were seized by the Americans and later returned to their rightful owners.
On May the 5th, 1945, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 reached Linz. By now, the Wehrmacht had capitulated here too. The cameraman filmed German soldiers being held prisoner at the historic Trinity, or Plague, column. In Linz, too, the spectre of Nazism had vanished as if nothing had ever happened. But German and Austrian soldiers, who for 6 years had enthusiastically followed Hitler on his criminal path, were now bearing the consequences.
Linz held a special significance for Adolf Hitler. It was here that the dictator had gone to school, and here that he had discovered the music of Richard Wagner. And it was in Linz that his beloved mother had been laid to rest. In his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, nearly every evening Hitler would pay a visit to a model of his plans to transform Linz. After achieving final victory, together with Eva Braun and his dog, he intended to retire to the city where he had grown up.
But in May 1945, that was the last thing the people of Linz wanted to hear. All that mattered now was their relationship with their new masters. The city's last defenders were marched off to American prisoner of war camps. On May the 5th, 1945, the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces, Admiral Karl Dönitz, decided first of all to end hostilities against the British. A secret command document reads,
"If we lay down our arms in northwest Germany, Denmark and Holland, it is because the fight against the Western powers has been rendered meaningless. But the battle in the East must continue to save as many Germans as possible from Bolshevism and enslavement. Through proud, manly behavior and dignity, each soldier has contributed to the German nation's shield of honor, remaining pure and sacrosanct. Even now, after a struggle, that has lasted 6 heroic and honorable years and is without parallel in world history.
Naturally, no mention was made of the countless crimes which soldiers of the Wehrmacht had committed or been complicit in. This cynical attitude, tantamount to historical amnesia, clearly corresponded to the attitude of most German soldiers. On May the 5th, a German soldier who was supposed to fight against the Red Army near Görlitz wrote in his diary,
"In the West, there is already a ceasefire. The end is near. The most bizarre rumors are doing the rounds. They say that the Americans will release our prisoners and rearm them in order to drive the Bolsheviks out of Germany, because our homeland must be liberated. Some of us still hope for a new offensive, but most of the troops want it to end. However, everyone is prepared to fight on immediately if it means joining forces with the Americans against the Russians. Then it will not matter how much longer the war lasts."
Somewhere outside Linz, the German prisoners of war encounter units of Vlasov's army. Since autumn 1944, around 100,000 members of the Russian Liberation Army had fought on the side of the Nazis against the Red Army, under the command of General Andrei Vlasov. The fate that awaited them was far grimmer than that facing their German comrades. In accordance with the Allied agreements made in Yalta, the Russians were to be handed over to the Soviet Union. Those who were not executed were banished to Siberia for at least 6 years. On the evening of May the 5th, 1945, author Erich Kästner noted in his diary,
"Depression is turning into irritability. Everyone is making someone else responsible. Everyone is blaming everyone else. And everyone is excluding just one person from this blame, themselves. Why are people irritable? Because they are surprised? But how can they be surprised? Did they actually believe the deception? Did they really confuse the outrageous rhetoric with facts? No one can be that stupid. You can only pretend to be. Now they are pretending to be surprised. In other words, they are playing dumb again. They would rather be thought of as a complete idiot than as a scoundrel."